Elijah Turner sat behind the wheel of his family's SUV, his fingers gripped tightly on the steering wheel. His eyes scanned the winding road ahead as the landscape blurred past, the hum of the engine a constant backdrop to the chaos in his mind. The windows were down, letting in the crisp evening air, but Elijah barely noticed. The tranquil countryside stretched out on either side, a sea of tall grass and distant trees, seemingly endless. It was meant to be the perfect escape, a peaceful, quiet retreat for him, his wife Camille, and their two children, Darnell and Ella, from the weight of the world. After years of being on call for high-stakes FBI cases, weeks of late nights spent chasing down criminals and living in constant tension, he had promised his family a break. Just a week of silence, of fresh air, and no demands. But as he drove deeper into the rural Georgia countryside, a sense of unease clung to him. It wasn't the road that unsettled him, it was the quiet. The kind of quiet that felt too still, too empty. The trees were dense, and the houses, few and far between, seemed to peer at him from the edges of the road with an almost predatory calm. Elijah had never been here before. Camille had booked the cabin, a secluded spot by a small lake that was supposed to be their sanctuary. But as the miles passed and the sun dipped lower behind the hills, Elijah's gut told him that this place, this corner of the world, wasn't as innocent as it seemed. He glanced over at Camille, who was sitting beside him in the passenger seat, her eyes glued to the map on her phone, searching for their turnoff. She hadn't noticed the shift in the air, the way the trees seemed to close in around them, or the tension that was starting to build in his chest. But he could feel it, deep in his bones. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts. His mind wandered back to the countless times he had walked into situations where things seemed calm on the surface, but violence and danger lurked just beneath. His training, his experience, none of it could prepare him for the suspicion he was beginning to feel. "You okay?" Camille asked, her voice soft, breaking his train of thought. He forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, just thinking," he replied. Camille raised an eyebrow but said nothing, sensing that it wasn't the right moment to press him. Darnell and Ella, sitting in the back seat, were lost in their own chatter, excited about the trip ahead. But Elijah's mind continued to race. He couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how far they tried to run from the pressures of his job, the weight of his past would always find a way to follow. And as the evening stretched on, the soft murmur of the countryside only seemed to grow louder, more menacing. By the time they reached the small town where they would stop for lunch, the sun had sunk low, casting long shadows over the streets. The town was small, quaint almost, with weathered brick buildings and dusty storefronts that looked like they hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. The diner they pulled into was a relic from another era, faded neon lights buzzing weakly above the entrance, the scent of grease and coffee hanging in the air. Elijah parked the car and killed the engine, casting one last glance at the sleepy streets. He didn't know what it was about this place, but the unease that had been simmering in him since they left the highway seemed to thicken now. "Looks like a nice spot," Camille said, her voice light, trying to lift the mood. She always had that ability to find the small joys, even in places that felt heavy. She unbuckled her seatbelt and turned back to Darnell and Ella, urging them to hurry up. "Let's get in there before your dad starts getting fussy about being on time." Darnell, his headphones already half on, rolled his eyes but smiled, jumping out of the car. Ella was already racing toward the diner, her short legs moving quickly, eager for her meal. Elijah hesitated for a moment before following them inside. As soon as the door swung open, a wave of cool air hit him, the contrast to the heat outside jarring against his skin. The few people inside paused at their entrance, the conversation halting mid-sentence. It wasn't the kind of pause that came from politeness. No, this was different. It was the kind of silence that felt like a weight pressing down. The few patrons seated at the booths and the counter exchanged looks, not making eye contact with Elijah or Camille, but not ignoring them either. Their gazes slid over them like oil on water, slick and quick. At the counter sat two police officers, their broad backs turned toward the family. The officers wore the kind of smirks that were a little too wide to be friendly. Elijah's gaze lingered on them just a moment too long, And one of the officers, a heavyset man with a bald head and thick arms, turned around slowly, his eyes scanning Elijah's face like he was already calculating his next move. The officer's mouth curled into a faint sneer as his eyes moved from Elijah to Camille, then finally settled on Darnell and Ella. Elijah's instincts kicked in, but he kept his face neutral. Camille, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to the tension building in the room. She smiled at the waitress, who was standing nearby, her hand resting on her hip, eyes narrowed slightly. "We'll just grab a quick bite," Camille said, trying to ease the silence. "Something simple for the kids." The waitress, who couldn't have been more than 20, gave a curt nod, her eyes lingering on Camille and then Elijah, her posture stiff. "I'll be right with you," she muttered before turning and walking toward the back of the diner. Elijah took a seat at one of the booths, his back to the officers. He didn't want to engage, not unless he had to. The officers were still watching them out of the corner of their eyes, exchanging whispered words that were too soft for Elijah to hear. But he knew the tone. It was the same tone he'd heard 1,000 times in his career, the tone of suspicion, of discomfort, of something simmering just beneath the surface. He leaned in, trying to hide the tension in his voice. "Camille, let's just eat and go. We don't need to linger here." She glanced up at him, a frown pulling at the corners of her mouth. "You okay? You've been quiet all day." "I'm fine," Elijah said, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." But Camille didn't seem convinced. She studied his face for a moment, then let it go, deciding not to press him. She turned to Darnell, who was already picking at the laminated menu in front of him, his headphones blaring music. Ella, as usual, was chattering away, asking her mother if they could get ice cream later. The seconds ticked by, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The place felt wrong in a way he couldn't put into words. The air was thick, charged with an energy he couldn't ignore. He forced himself to take a breath, focusing on the clink of silverware against plates and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. But just as he thought maybe he was overreacting, something snapped in the room. The officer closest to the door, Officer Burke, stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Elijah tensed immediately, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. Burke didn't walk toward the bathroom or make any move to leave. Instead, he crossed the room toward their table with slow, deliberate steps, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. The other officer, a younger man with a buzz cut, followed closely behind, his expression unreadable. Elijah didn't need to be told what was happening. He knew. This was it. This was the moment. Officer Burke stopped just short of the table, towering over Elijah. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Elijah's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "You folks lost?" he asked, his voice dripping with thinly veiled contempt. There was no hello, no pleasantries, just an accusation disguised as a question. Elijah didn't flinch. He met the officer's gaze without hesitation. "Just passing through," he replied evenly, his voice steady. "We're here for a little vacation." Burke didn't seem satisfied with the answer. His lips twisted into a smirk. "Vacation, huh? Don't see too many folks like you around here." There was no doubt now. Burke had made up his mind. Elijah's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Just here for a couple of days," he said, glancing at Camille briefly. Her eyes were wide, but she remained silent, sensing the change in the air. Before Elijah could say anything more, Officer Burke stepped closer, almost looming over him. "Mind if we take a look at your ID?" he asked, his tone now less of a question and more of an order. Elijah's stomach tightened. He could feel the sudden shift in the air, the subtle change from curiosity to hostility. The officer's body language was a warning, a challenge. Camille's hand reached out, her fingers brushing Elijah's. "Let's just go," she said quietly, trying to de-escalate, trying to diffuse the tension. But Officer Burke wasn't finished. His eyes flicked to the other officer, who was standing in the background, waiting for any sign of resistance. Burke's voice dropped lower, his words coated in menace. "You don't just get to roll through here like you own the place," he said. "We've got rules and you're going to follow them." The room fell deathly silent. Every pair of eyes in the diner was on them now, watching, waiting. The other patrons had gone still, some of them leaning forward, their attention locked onto the scene unfolding at the table. Elijah's heart beat louder in his chest. This wasn't just about an ID check anymore. This was about something deeper, something older. Before he could respond, Burke grabbed Elijah by the arm, his grip like iron. The sudden, rough touch sent a jolt of adrenaline through Elijah's body. The flash of recognition, the flicker of memories of what could come next, struck him hard. In that moment, he realized just how quickly things could spiral out of control. And as Burke pulled him to his feet, the eyes of the town watched, waiting to see what would happen next. The moment Burke's hand latched onto Elijah's arm, a spark of adrenaline shot through him, igniting a rush of emotions. His body tensed, the muscles in his shoulders locking. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Not here, not now. But Elijah had been in these situations before. He knew what it felt like to be watched, judged, to have someone decide your worth in an instant. He'd survived it time and time again. But this felt different. This wasn't just a random encounter. There was an edge to it, something more deliberate. His mind raced. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to escalate things. But the fingers digging into his arm were a reminder that the balance of power was not in his favor. Burke's grip tightened, and a low, simmering anger began to stir within him. He could feel Camille's gaze on him, but he refused to look at her. If he looked at her, he knew the situation would break. He couldn't let that happen, not in front of their kids. Not now. Darnell, still seated, hadn't yet understood what was happening. The boy was too focused on his phone, headphones still in place, eyes glued to the screen. But Ella was staring, wide-eyed, her small face twisted with confusion. Her innocent gaze locked onto her father, and Elijah's heart sank. He couldn't let her see him like this. Not the anger, not the fear. "Sir, I asked you to step aside," Burke said, his voice a low growl now. "I'm trying to do this the easy way, but you're making it hard." "I told you I'm not doing anything wrong," Elijah said, his voice low but firm. He wasn't raising it, not yet. Raising his voice would only give Burke more ammunition, more reasons to escalate. His FBI training kicked in then. Remain calm, stay in control. This was just another case, another criminal encounter. He'd handled worse. He could handle this. But Burke wasn't listening. The officer twisted Elijah's arm, a clear attempt to assert dominance, and Elijah's jaw clenched. He fought the instinct to push back, to force his way out of the grip. That was what they wanted, to provoke him, to get him to make a move so they could justify what came next. He could see the hunger in Burke's eyes, the way the officer's muscles tensed, just waiting for a reason to act. "Let go of me," Elijah said, his voice quieter, but the threat was there. Burke leaned in closer, his breath hot on Elijah's face. "You don't give the orders here," Burke spat, his voice venomous. "We do." The words stung, the realization that this wasn't about an ID check anymore. It wasn't even about justice or the law. This was about power. Burke was asserting his, and Elijah was the target. He could feel the heat of the room closing in on him, the eyes of every single person in the diner fixed on them. Some were curious, others eager for the drama, but most seemed resigned to the idea of what was unfolding. This wasn't new. Not here. Not in a place like this. Camille's voice cracked through the tension, sharp and pleading. "Please, just let him go. We're not causing any trouble. We just want to eat and leave." She stood up, her hands shaking as she tried to reach for Elijah. But Burke stepped between them, blocking her path. "You don't tell me what to do, ma'am," Burke snapped, "and you can't tell him to keep his hands off me. We're just doing our job." Elijah's chest tightened as he fought the urge to react. He could feel the blood rushing in his ears, the pressure building behind his eyes. This was the moment where so many things could go wrong, where anger, fear, and frustration could spill over, where everything could turn violent. "Camille, get the kids in the car," Elijah said, his tone clipped. He was trying to keep it together, trying to make sure his family was safe, but it was getting harder with every second that passed. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Burke barked at him. "You think you can just waltz in here, talk your way out of this? You're going to do exactly what I say." Elijah could feel the weight of the words sinking into his bones. the accusation ringing louder with every passing moment. Burke was profiling him. He was targeting him because of who he was, because of how he looked. That wasn't lost on Elijah. It never was. He had grown up in a world where every day was an invisible test. The way his blackness made people uncomfortable, made them suspicious. He had learned how to navigate it, how to keep his head down, how to survive. But this wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was an open attack. "Stop it," Camille said, her voice rising. "We're leaving, right now." But Burke didn't back off. Instead, he pushed harder. "I'm placing you under arrest for disorderly conduct." His words were filled with mock authority, and the air grew thick with the weight of them. Elijah's mind spun. He couldn't allow this to happen. Not here. Not like this. "I'm not resisting," he said, keeping his tone steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "You have no right to do this." Burke didn't listen. "We'll see about that." Suddenly, the younger officer moved in, his hands grabbing Elijah's other arm, forcing him toward the door. Elijah resisted, though he knew fighting would only make things worse. Burke's hand was still tight around his wrist, dragging him, like Elijah was some criminal, like he didn't belong here. "Let go!" Elijah grunted, trying to break free, but it was like trying to escape from a vice. Burke's grip was unyielding, his power over Elijah undeniable. Every second felt like a lifetime as the officers maneuvered him toward the door. Camille had taken a step forward, panic evident in her face. "Stop! Please, just stop!" But it wasn't stopping. None of it was. The sound of Ella crying reached Elijah's ears. His heart wrenched. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Not here, not now. The door opened with a jingle, and the afternoon sun poured in, lighting up the scene outside. Elijah's mind raced, fighting to make sense of everything. But there was nothing that could make this right. There was no logic to the way things were spiraling. He knew his rights. He knew the law. But none of that mattered now. He wasn't a man in control anymore. He was just a black man in a small town, and the people with the power weren't interested in justice. They weren't interested in facts. They just wanted to break him. The officers shoved him toward the squad car, and Elijah stumbled, trying to regain his footing. He could hear the faint whispers of the diner's patrons, some laughing, some muttering under their breath. They were watching. They were all watching. But the worst part wasn't that they were looking at him. It was that they didn't seem surprised. They didn't seem to care. "Get in the car," Burke barked, slamming the door open, his face red with rage. Elijah's body went rigid, but he had no choice but to comply. His heart was pounding now, blood rushing in his ears. He glanced over his shoulder at Camille, at Darnell and Ella. His family was there, helpless, caught in this nightmare. "Don't make this worse," Elijah said through gritted teeth. But Burke was already moving to close the door, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. The world outside the car felt distant now, muffled. The reality of what was happening had sunk in fully. Elijah had to fight. He had to find a way to survive this. Because in that moment, he realized this wasn't just an arrest. This was a message. And if he didn't find a way out of it, his family would pay the price. The door slammed shut. The engine of the squad car roared to life, the sound deafening in Elijah's ears as he was shoved into the back seat. The door slamming shut with a finality that shook him to his core. His heart pounded in his chest, every breath a struggle against the suffocating weight of the situation. He could feel the rough fabric of the seat against his back, the air thick with tension as the officer slid into the front seat beside him. Elijah's mind raced, thoughts jumbled, his training fighting against the primal instinct to react, to lash out. His pulse spiked, his blood running hot, the feeling of being trapped gnawing at him. From the moment they slammed the door behind him, he knew they were no longer interested in what was right. This wasn't just about an arrest. This wasn't about disorderly conduct or anything resembling law. This was power. This was a display. Burke had made his move, and he wasn't going to stop until he'd broken Elijah, made him small, insignificant. The fear and helplessness that had gripped him before were replaced now with a cold rage. But rage, Elijah knew, wasn't a luxury he could afford. Not now. He twisted in the seat, trying to catch a glimpse of Camille, Darnell, and Ella. But the rear windows were tinted, blocking his view. His stomach dropped. Camille's face, etched with fear, was the last thing he saw before the door closed. He could hear her voice, calling his name, but it was fading now, drowned by the sound of the engine revving. The panic in her voice clawed at him, but he couldn't respond. He couldn't reassure her. The only thing he could do now was find a way out. "Where are you taking me?" Elijah asked, his voice controlled but laced with an undercurrent of anger that he couldn't fully suppress. He stared ahead at the back of the officer's head, the words thick on his tongue. "What is this? What are you charging me with?" Burke didn't answer immediately. The officer in the passenger seat glanced at him, then at Burke. Elijah could see them both in the rearview mirror, their eyes briefly meeting as if weighing something. Finally, Burke spoke, his voice low, almost bored. "You'll find out soon enough." Elijah didn't know what it meant, but the unease that had settled in his stomach only deepened. He tried to focus, to think, to strategize. He wasn't some helpless man. He had resources, connections. He had power. He wasn't just any civilian. He was an FBI agent. But Burke didn't know that. Or if he did, he didn't care. The car rattled along the dusty roads, the hum of the tires against the pavement filling the silence. Time seemed to stretch, each second heavy with uncertainty. Elijah's mind flashed back to the lessons he had been taught. Stay calm, stay quiet, gather information. Don't make a move until you're sure. His father had told him, countless times, that he had to live in both worlds. The one where he was a man of power and intellect, and the one where his skin alone could get him killed. And now as they passed mile after mile of nothing but farmland and trees, the question gnawed at him. How much further was this town going to take it? It was then that the car began to slow. The engine's roar faded, and Elijah could feel a shift in the atmosphere. Burke took a sharp turn down an overgrown gravel road, the tires crunching beneath the weight of the car. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. His mind clicked into survival mode. This wasn't a police station. It wasn't a place where they would process him. The road ahead was dark, the trees casting long shadows over the path. They were out of sight now, far beyond the last trace of civilization. The car finally came to a stop, the engine idling in the silence. Burke turned off the ignition. The hairs on the back of Elijah's neck stood on end. He could feel the dread creeping up, thickening the air in the car. Something was wrong. "What the hell is going on?" Elijah demanded, now standing in the back seat, his fists clenched, his pulse racing. Burke's eyes flicked to him in the mirror, a wicked gleam in his gaze. "You're not going anywhere, not until we've had a little chat." A sudden surge of fear gripped Elijah's chest as he realized what was happening. Burke was taking him out of sight, out of reach. He was alone now, completely isolated, no witnesses, no safety net. The officer in the passenger seat, younger but no less menacing, climbed out of the car and circled around to Elijah's side. The door was yanked open with force, and before Elijah could react, the officer grabbed his arm and yanked him out of the car. He stumbled, the gravel digging into his shoes, his balance faltering. His eyes scanned the surrounding trees, the endless forest, silent and watchful. There were no roads, no houses, nothing. Just the oppressive, suffocating quiet. He wasn't in control anymore. Burke followed, taking his time to step out of the car. "You don't get to make the rules here," he sneered, his voice rough. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is our town. You'll follow our lead, or there will be consequences." Elijah's mind raced as his thoughts circled like a whirlwind. He had to keep his cool. He had to think. He'd been in worse situations before, hadn't he? He could talk his way out of this. He could diffuse it. But everything inside him screamed that this was no ordinary situation. The younger officer, who hadn't said much up until now, was circling him like a wolf, sizing him up. His eyes were full of contempt, and Elijah could see the satisfaction in his movements, as if he was waiting for the moment when Elijah would break. "Let's make this easy, man," the younger officer said, stepping closer, his voice slow and deliberate. "Just tell us who you really are, and we'll let you go. We know you're not some regular guy. We know you're kind." The insinuation hung in the air, thick and heavy. Elijah's chest tightened as the words settled in. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice firm but shaking with the undercurrent of fear. "I'm just trying to get on with my life. What's your problem with me?" Burke stepped closer, his face a mere inch from Elijah's. "You think you can come into our town and act like you're above it all?" he growled. "We've seen your type before. You think the law doesn't apply to you?" Elijah's stomach twisted with a sickening realization. They didn't see him as a person, didn't see him as someone with a family, a life, a job. They saw the color of his skin, and that was all they needed to decide who he was. The officer in front of him raised his hand. Quick, decisive, like he was about to strike. Elijah reacted on instinct. Before the officer could land the blow, he twisted his body, using the momentum to break free from the younger officer's grasp. In a flash, he shoved past him, his body surging with energy, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Burke lunged at him, his heavy hands swinging through the air, but Elijah was faster. He ducked and sprinted, his feet slamming against the gravel as he pushed forward. But the escape was short-lived. A sharp pain shot through his side as Burke tackled him from behind, slamming Elijah to the ground. The breath was knocked out of him, and for a moment, everything went dark. "Stay down!" Burke shouted, straddling him, his fists ready to land another blow. Elijah's mind was still spinning, but his instincts kicked in. He fought back, his fists striking hard at Burke's chest, his legs kicking, pushing, trying to break free. Every fiber of his being screamed to get away. But no matter how much he struggled, he couldn't outrun the violence that was closing in on him. And then he heard it, his family's voices. A sharp scream from Camille. "Elijah, no!" Everything froze. The world outside the car blurred into a swirl of motion, the trees and fields fading into indistinct shadows as the vehicle sped away. Elijah's hands trembled on the steering wheel, though he couldn't be sure whether it was from the adrenaline still coursing through his veins or the lingering tension from what had just happened. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart thudding like a war drum, but there was no time to calm down. Not yet. He had to think. He had to focus. He had to keep his family safe. Camille sat beside him, her hands tightly gripping her seat, her face pale but her eyes were full of questions, full of fear and disbelief. She glanced at him, then out the window, then back at him again, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Darnell and Ella were silent in the back seat, the latter still clutching her stuffed animal like a lifeline, her eyes wide and unblinking. Elijah didn't know how to explain it, how to make them understand what had just happened, how to make sense of the rage, the violence, the desperation that had seized him in those moments when Burke had grabbed him, when Camille had charged forward without thinking, when everything had shattered, and they had been reduced to nothing more than targets in someone's twisted game of power. All the training, all the discipline he had cultivated over the years, it had crumbled in the face of something too real, too painful. Burke's words still echoed in his mind. "You think the law doesn't apply to you?" The weight of them, the accusation in the officer's voice, it wasn't just a question, it was a verdict. He could still feel the heat of the gravel beneath his feet, the brutal force of the officer's hands on his body. He could still hear Camille's voice, desperate and fierce, calling out his name, refusing to let him go without a fight. "Stay down, Elijah," she had begged. "Please don't make it worse." But it had already been worse. The moment they crossed that line, the moment Burke and his partner decided to treat him like a criminal just because of his skin, it had already become something bigger, and no amount of restraint could make it go back to the way it was. The silence in the car stretched, oppressive, suffocating. He could feel Camille's gaze on him, though he didn't dare look at her. Not yet. He needed a moment to collect himself, to think. "Are we safe?" Camille's voice broke through the silence, fragile and raw. She wasn't looking at him when she spoke, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. But he knew the question was directed at him. He was the one with the answers, the one who was supposed to keep them safe. I don't know," Elijah admitted, his voice hoarse and unsure. He wanted to say something more reassuring, something strong, but the truth was, he had no idea what would happen next. Burke and his partner weren't ordinary officers. They weren't just doing their jobs. This was personal. The way Burke had grabbed him, the way he'd thrown him to the ground without a second thought, there was no way that was about procedure. No way it was about protecting and serving. The more Elijah thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a pattern. A man like Burke didn't operate in a vacuum. There were people who thought like him, who believed that they had the right to treat others however they saw fit, especially people who looked like Elijah. And the worst part was that the system, the very laws that were supposed to protect him, had failed him, had failed them all because of the color of their skin. The thought twisted inside him, knotted up with guilt and frustration. How many times had he heard about similar incidents? How many stories of families, of innocent people, being harassed, arrested, even killed, all because of the same systemic biases that had nearly consumed them today? "We have to go to the authorities," Camille said, her voice barely above a whisper. But Elijah could hear the plea in it, the hope that someone, anyone, would listen, would do something. Elijah shook his head, the weight of the thought crashing over him like a wave. "I'm not sure there's anyone we can trust," he said, the words coming out more bitter than he intended. He knew Camille was right. He knew they should report it. He knew they should fight back, bring the officers to justice. But in that moment, everything felt hopeless. Everything felt like a setup. If Burke and his partner could operate like this in the open, with so little concern for consequences, what would happen if they went to the authorities? Would anyone believe them? Would anyone stand up to the power these men had? Just as the tension in the car began to swell, the sound of a siren sliced through the air. A car pulled up behind them, fast, its lights flashing red and blue, casting streaks of color against the trees. Elijah's heart skipped. His eyes flicked to Camille, then to the rearview mirror. He knew that siren, knew what it meant. Backup, another cruiser, 2 more officers. "No," Elijah murmured under his breath. "No, no, no." His hand tightened on the wheel, his eyes flicking nervously from the road to the rearview mirror. He couldn't take any more. They couldn't go through this again, not with backup, not with everything at stake. The car sped up, the sirens growing louder, more insistent. Elijah slammed his foot on the gas pedal, his eyes darting between the road and the flashing lights behind them. Camille's grip tightened on the door as she leaned forward. "Elijah, we have to stop. We can't outrun them forever." "I'm not stopping," Elijah said, his voice shaking with panic and determination. He didn't know what was worse, being dragged back to those officers, or being stuck in this goddamn small town, always looking over his shoulder. He didn't trust anyone anymore. Not now. Not with the officers back there. Not with the system he thought would protect him. He had no choice but to run. "Please, Elijah," Camille's voice cracked, her hand reaching out to him. "We have to think this through. They'll chase us. They're not getting us again," Elijah snapped, cutting her off, his voice edged with something raw and dangerous. His knuckles were white around the wheel. "I'm not letting them take you. Not like this." The cruiser behind them didn't slow. It was getting closer. Much too close. Elijah's heart raced. His pulse hammered in his ears. He could feel the panic creeping up on him, but he forced it back down. He needed to think. He needed to keep them safe. They couldn't stop. Not until they were out of the county. Not until they were free. But as the sirens grew louder and the world outside the car seemed to close in around them, Elijah knew they couldn't keep running forever. The nightmare wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The car swerved sharply down the winding roads, its tires screeching as Elijah pushed the accelerator harder, ignoring the growing sound of sirens that reverberated through the vehicle. He didn't look back, didn't dare to, but he could feel the pressure mounting, the sense of being hunted, cornered like prey. But something deep inside him was shifting, a new resolve stirring in his chest. He wasn't going to run forever. He couldn't. Not with his family in the back seat. Not after everything that had happened. If the system wouldn't protect them, he'd have to force it to. The sirens were still behind them, but as they neared the edge of town, Elijah saw the familiar flicker of city lights ahead, signaling the entrance to the next jurisdiction. A sharp, bitter thought crossed his mind. Was this just another line in a long string of places where they'd be treated as outcasts? Another patch of land where people of color weren't welcome? The thought made his chest tighten with frustration, but it also fueled his resolve. The system had failed them today. It had failed every single person who had ever been subjected to this kind of violence. But Elijah wasn't going to let them be silenced, not this time. He made a sharp turn off the main road, into a less traveled side street, and pulled the car into a hidden corner behind an abandoned building. For a long moment, everything was still, the only sound the erratic beat of his heart. His eyes flicked to Camille, who was now sitting silently beside him, her face a mask of exhaustion and determination. Darnell and Ella were silent in the back seat, their faces pale, still processing everything that had just happened. But Elijah could see the fear in their eyes, the way they clung to each other, their hands pressed tightly together. This wasn't the vacation they had planned. This wasn't the life they had worked so hard to build. "We're safe," Elijah said finally, though his words sounded hollow even to him. He wasn't sure if he meant the words or if he was just trying to reassure himself. Camille didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced out the window, her brow furrowed, her lips pressed tightly together. He could see the wheels turning in her mind, and he knew what she was thinking. They both knew the fight wasn't over. They had survived this encounter, but that was just the beginning. The world outside hadn't changed. The system that allowed men like Burke to walk free, the laws that protected officers no matter what crimes they committed, was still intact. "We need to talk to a lawyer," Camille said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil that clung to her every word. "We need to make sure they're held accountable for what they did." Elijah nodded, though doubt still gnawed at him. "They'll say it was a mistake," he muttered, his voice tight. "They'll cover it up. They always do." "We can't let them," Camille said, her voice firm, almost as if she was trying to convince herself just as much as she was trying to convince him. "We can't let them get away with this." He glanced over at her, surprised by the conviction in her voice. It was the same fire he'd seen in her the day they'd met, the one that had kept her going through their struggles, the one that had driven them to build a life in a world that so often told them they didn't belong. But now more than ever, he knew the weight of what they were asking. "You know what they'll do, Camille," Elijah said, his tone darker now. "They'll call us liars. They'll twist it. We're not going to be able to do anything, not with everything stacked against us." But Camille shook her head, her eyes hard. "We're not the ones who need to be afraid," she said quietly, her voice a steady calm in the storm of his doubts. "They're the ones who need to answer for what they did." A silence fell between them, but it wasn't empty. It was a space filled with determination, with something stronger than fear. A promise. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest, but as he looked at Camille, at the fire in her eyes, he knew she was right. They couldn't let this go. They couldn't let themselves become another story told in whispers, another statistic erased. They had to fight, and they would. Back at the police station, Burke and his partner were already in the midst of damage control, though it was clear from their hushed tones and quick glances that they weren't prepared for the aftermath of their actions. Word had already started to spread about the altercation. Eyewitnesses had seen it unfold, and the shock was spreading fast, even in the town where such brutality had been commonplace. Officers who'd stood by, perhaps assuming it was just another routine stop, were now coming to grips with the reality that this time, there were witnesses. This time, there were people who wouldn't stay silent. But it wasn't just about the incident itself. It was about the long-standing culture of silence and complicity that had allowed it to happen in the first place. The cracks in the system were showing, but they weren't just showing to the victims. They were showing to the people who had spent their lives upholding a justice that was anything but. In a closed meeting room at the station, the chief of police sat surrounded by officers, some with their heads down, others trying to maintain their calm as they discussed the events of the night. "We have to make sure this doesn't spiral out of control," one officer said, his voice low and tense. "This could get ugly if the media gets a hold of it." Another officer nodded. "Yeah, but we can't let it slide either. We've been too lenient with them. We've let them get away with too much for too long." There was a moment of silence as the words settled in. A murmur of agreement swept through the room, but there was an underlying tension, a reluctance to face the truth that had been laid bare, the truth that there was something fundamentally broken about the system they were supposed to uphold. Outside the walls of the police station, the town was waking up to the reality of what had happened. Protests began to form, small at first, but growing in size as more people came forward, as more witnesses shared their stories. News outlets picked up on the story, local stations reporting what had transpired, how two officers had been caught abusing their power in a violent, unnecessary confrontation with a family just passing through town. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Civil rights organizations began calling for an investigation. Activists rallied. And while the authorities tried to downplay the situation, it was clear that things were changing. The community had seen enough. The people weren't willing to sit back anymore, not when they had seen the truth. Elijah didn't know what the future held. He didn't know how long it would take for justice to be served, or if it ever truly would be. But he knew one thing for certain. They couldn't let this die. They couldn't let it be swept under the rug. Not again. The world had seen them, heard their story, and now it was their turn to make sure it counted. And so, together, with Camille by his side, Elijah made a vow. They would fight for accountability. They would fight for change. For every family who had ever been hurt, for every person who had ever been wronged, they would stand up, speak out, and demand that justice be done. They wouldn't stop until those who abused their power were held responsible. They wouldn't stop until the system was forced to change. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty, but also with a quiet resolve. Elijah knew that the road ahead would be long, filled with battles that weren't always visible, that didn't always have immediate results. There would be moments when the weight of everything would threaten to pull him under, when the system would fight back, when the media would twist the narrative, when the world would demand that he forget, move on, and accept the status quo. But in those moments when doubt crept in like a shadow, Elijah would think back to Camille's eyes, full of unwavering strength and the quiet power that had come from knowing they weren't alone. They had seen the truth. And the truth, no matter how ugly, no matter how inconvenient, was something that couldn't be silenced. The investigation into Burke and his partner moved slowly, as investigations often did, but the pressure never relented. In the weeks that followed, protests in the town grew larger, their voices echoing through the streets. People who had lived in silence for so long, afraid of retribution, of losing their jobs or reputations, had found the courage to speak up. They too had seen what had happened. They too had witnessed the violence, the cruelty of the officers who thought they were untouchable. It wasn't just Elijah and Camille's fight anymore. It had become the fight of everyone who had ever felt the sting of racism, the weight of systemic injustice. And it wasn't just the town that was waking up. The world was watching. The media coverage expanded, and soon the story reached further than anyone had anticipated. What had started as a small act of defiance, a desperate cry for help, had become a rallying cry for change. More families shared their own stories of police brutality, of racial profiling, of living in constant fear, even as they tried to build lives for themselves, even as they tried to move through the world without being seen as a threat. It was a chorus of voices, rising louder every day, demanding justice. Elijah had always known that fighting against the system would be a battle, a long, uphill struggle. But what he hadn't fully realized until this moment was how powerful it could be when people refused to stay silent, when they refused to let their pain go unheard. It was terrifying, yes. It was dangerous, yes. But it was also the only way forward, the only way to break the cycle. One evening, weeks after the confrontation, Elijah stood outside their home, looking out over the small patch of grass that had become a symbol of peace, of normalcy in a world that seemed determined to tear it away. Camille joined him, her hand slipping into his. There was still so much work to do, so many systems to challenge, so many minds to change. But as he looked at her, at the children now safe in their home, he knew they had taken the first step, and that was more than enough. "I never thought we'd be here, Elijah," Camille said softly, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and a quiet pride. "I never thought we'd have to fight like this." He squeezed her hand, his heart full of 1,000 unspoken words. "I didn't either," he replied. "But now, I can't unsee it. I can't unhear it. And I won't let it happen to anyone else. The message was clear. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over until the systems of power that had been built on the backs of marginalized communities were torn down, restructured, and rebuilt with true justice for all. But that fight would not be waged in isolation. It would be a collective effort, voices speaking in unity, actions that were loud enough to disrupt the status quo. Elijah knew this was just the beginning. There was no going back. There would be no more silence. He turned toward Camille, his gaze firm, his resolve unshakable. "We keep fighting," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We keep pushing. We make sure no one ever forgets." And with that, they walked back into the house, ready to face whatever came next. But knowing this, change was possible, and they would be part of it every step of the way. It wasn't a perfect world, and the road ahead would be long and hard. But for the first time, Elijah could see the faintest glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. And that, he realized, was enough to keep going, one step at a time,